May is Mental Health Month. We talk with two of our organization's experts on mental health, mental illness, and its intersection with gun violence prevention. Right now on CSGV at Home. Hello and welcome to CSGV at Home. My name is Andrew Patrick. I'm the Director of Political Communications at the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. I want to thank you for watching. Today, we're joined by two of our organizational experts in mental health and gun violence, Director of Strategic Communications, Bryan, and our State Affairs Manager, Lisa Geller. Hey, friendships. I want to thank you guys for taking the time.
Thanks for having us.
So, Bryan, what is Mental Health Month? It's May is Mental Health Month. Why is it important that we talk about it?
So as you said, May is Mental Health Month, and the goal this month is to raise awareness about mental health and destigmatize mental illness. And both of these things are really important to me and personal for me because I live with bipolar disorder. Sometimes mental health and mental illness are used interchangeably, but there is a distinction. Mental health refers to a person's overall mental well-being, and everyone has mental health, while mental illness refers to specific conditions that not everyone has. People who are suffering from poor mental health might not be diagnosed with a mental illness, and people with mental illness can experience periods of well-being, so it goes both ways. You definitely don't need a diagnosis to make your mental health a priority. So basically, Mental Health Month is a great time for everyone to assess and take steps to improve their mental health, whether they live with mental illness or not. Destigmatizing mental illness is really important in gun violence prevention because for far too long, people with mental illness have been blamed for acts of interpersonal violence. The evidence does not support this, and I personally know how harmful these kinds of misconceptions can be for people who have lived experience with mental illness. People with mental illness should be protected and included in the gun violence prevention movement and not used as a scapegoat.
Yeah, exactly right. Lisa, as we talk about mental health and mental illness, like Bryan said, why is it important to talk about as our organization and others in the movement address America's gun violence epidemic, particularly when it comes to firearm suicide?
Well, as Bryan mentioned, mental illness is almost never the cause of interpersonal violence. And so it's very important that when we're talking about policies to prevent gun violence, we're not focusing on a mental health diagnosis or a mental illness when we're coming up with these criteria for these policies. In fact, less than 4% of violence towards others, it can be attributed to severe mental illness. So very, very small fraction. But what we know is that when these mass shootings are covered in the news or other instances of gun violence, mental illness, as Bryan says, is often attributed. And we know that that's incorrect, and it does stigmatize those living with mental illness, of which there are a lot of people in this country. However, when we look at the intersection between suicide and mental illness, there is a stronger connection there. That's not to say that all of suicides or all firearm suicides are attributed to mental illness, but there is a stronger connection than there is with interpersonal violence. It's also important to note that suicides make up the majority of gun deaths. And so when we talk about gun violence in America and we leave out suicides, we're leaving out the majority of gun deaths. We're leaving out 60% of gun deaths. And so the conversation surrounding gun violence and gun violence prevention has to include all forms of gun violence.
Anything you want to add, Bryan?
I think it's just important to note, as Lisa mentioned, that not everyone who dies by suicide has a mental illness, but many do. Suicide is a huge mental health problem, and it's a problem that has a lot of social factors that contribute to it as well. Personally, I was diagnosed with bipolar 10 years ago, and there are moments throughout the course of my illness where I know that if I had had a gun in the home, I likely would not be alive today. If there hadn't been that distance separating me from a firearm and I hadn't had time to make a different decision, I wouldn't be here talking to you about this really important issue. So I think that it's very important to consider suicide within the broader gun violence prevention conversation and include those deaths.
So at CSGV, the past the 5 years or so, we've really focused on the language that we use when talking about this issue. Why is language so vital to the way that we talk about mental illness? Because like Lisa said, The gun lobby and others have used mental illness as a scapegoat. The problem is mental illness is a broad spectrum. It's such a broad definition in America, where millions and millions of people have some form of mental illness. So the way we talk about it in a way that makes it make sure it's not stigmatizing, why is that such an important factor? Either one.
I think language is really important because it informs how we treat people and how we treat issues surrounding mental health and surrounding the intersection of mental health and gun violence. Insensitive language and stigmatizing language it reinforces stigma, and using that kind of language is a distraction that the gun lobby likes to use a lot. And then people in the gun violence prevention movement, it's gotten better, but for a long time people would follow the gun lobby's lead and use the same language to talk about people with mental illness. It really allows people to blame another group of people, in this case people with mental illness, by dehumanizing them and not focusing on the real problem, which is gun violence and access to guns. So when we're talking about people who live with mental illness, it's just really important to remember that we're still talking about people. I can't tell you how many times in my personal experience I've had someone make disparaging comments about bipolar, the condition I live with, or mental illness in general, or the treatments used to manage it, or psychiatric hospitals, or any of those things, without realizing that they're talking to someone who manages and lives with all of those things on a daily basis. And it's hurtful. So I think it's important to recognize that you may be using language that is hurting someone within earshot or someone that you're even directly talking to. And then finally, stigmatizing language is hurtful because it can discourage people from getting the help that they need. Whether they have a diagnosis or not, everyone has mental health and everyone should feel safe reaching out for help without shame. And the language we use either encourages people to reach out for help or discourages them.
Absolutely. Lisa, anything you want to add?
I would just reiterate that this is a problem, not just in the gun violence prevention movement, but certainly has been around for a long time. And I think what CSGV and other organizations are getting better at is using this person first language and recognizing that this is a person first, as Bryan said. This may be someone that lives with mental illness, lives with a severe mental illness. It doesn't mean they are dangerously mentally ill. And when we use that language, like Bryan said, we're discouraging people from getting help. We're playing into this rhetoric that is stigmatizing many, many millions of people in this country.
That's right. Well, thank you guys both so much for joining us. Like I said, May is Mental Health Month. Let's focus on it. Let's keep advancing the way we talk about this, the way we educate the public on this. And just thank you and take care, guys.